Congratulations on making it to the end of this section. I know we were fairly fast paced, so that's why I always like to do a quick code review and go over some of the finer details of what we've done in the earlier lessons in order to wrap up this section. So first of all, we started out by setting up our CSS and styling. Tried to keep it to a minimum with a little bit of adding of the styling to make it look interesting, but we did keep it to a minimum. As well as the HTML, and of course, these ones can be created with JavaScript as well, but usually I do like to have some HTML in order to kind of get the project started once we start out the project. And you are welcome to update this so that it's all just JavaScript as well. And you can easily create these elements on the fly as we build out the rest of the game board instead of having them already hard-coded into the HTML. So next it came to the JavaScript, and this is what you came for, and this is what the course is all about. It's all about working and interacting with JavaScript. We had to set some default variables in the beginning in order to have some values in order to utilize those in the upcoming lessons. And we set a variable for box. So this was essentially the element that is the player. And this is the one that we're going to be manipulating and moving as the player moves around the board. We also have our score. This gave us really easy access to the element with the class of score. And then our game area. And we also utilized the game area, the get bounding client rectangle. So this was really important because it gave us the barriers and the parameters that we needed to contain in order to work within the game area. It also helped to calculate what our game grid looked like. So we've got our game box and we calculated how many X and how many Y. So basically the horizontal and vertical squares that we needed in order to build our grid. We set up a default variable called squares. So this was to hold all of our elements arrays in all of the elements that are the squares within the game grid so that we could easily access them, manipulate them, and update them within our JavaScript code. Then we set up some values for the players. So these are some just generic values. We've got the speed at 100, and we could also take this and utilize it within the box offset height and offset width if we wanted to. So if you do have different heights and widths, you might want to have a speed for X and a speed for Y if you want to extend on it. Easiest way, of course, is to keep them both the same and then hard code it at 100. But if you do want to have some more flexibility in the game, you're welcome to update those values and update them correspondingly and accordingly. We set the document content loaded event listener. So this listens for whenever our document content has loaded, like the name implies. And once it does load, then that's where we fire off build. And build, what that does is it's a function that creates our whole gameplay. It creates the player character, the box, adds the class of box, sets the starting X and Y positions, updates the box styling, and then appends it to our game area so that's visible to the player. And we also build out our grid within this function as well. You could break these apart to separate it out, but for now, this is a really simple game, and we've got all of this happening within the original build, so that's why we're just keeping it this way. But of course, you could separate it out if you get more complex with the game build. Also, then we are setting out, and we're starting with a counter of 1. This is our first square. We're looping through all of the game box X and Y. That's the count, how many squares we need across, how many rows, how many columns we need. And we're building out the grid. So creating the elements dynamically using JavaScript, updating their inner HTML with the value of counters so that we know that they've all got different numbers. And then also taking that squares counter, adding our square class to that element, and then finally appending it to our game area so it's visible to the player, and then updating counter so that we always have a different value there for the inner HTML. So it makes them all unique and also helps the player better understand which square they're on, of course. Then we launch the function makeActive, and what makeActive does is it selects from all of the squares that we just built randomly using that squares array, which is global, taking the length value of it, and we're checking to make sure that 0 is not the selected random value, and if it is, then we need to select again. And also we're taking our player square and we're making sure that we're not selecting the same square that the player is currently sitting on, because then you're gonna not have smooth gameplay. And we can get rid of the console message. We don't need that anymore. And we're selecting and we're adding the class list of active. Also then we're ending the function. And if it's not doesn't meet these parameters, then we're launching make active again. So basically it will run this function until we get our desired result, which is none of these are going to be true. So next we have our user interaction, and that is done with adding the event listener for key up. So whenever the user presses a key and the key goes up, that's where we add our key function. So we limiting it to only certain keys that we're going to be utilizing, and that's the left, up, right, down. Now you don't have to do this. You can use it by the key presses and attaching values to those key presses, of course, and then checking for those key presses. But this is just another way to kind of make your code a little bit cleaner and restrict some of the key presses. And then you can, of course, add in different key presses, and you can also have certain keys that do the same thing. So if we wanted to add in some character keys that could move it left, up, right, down, we could do it in this way a lot easier. So that's another advantage to doing it this format. So we're checking to see if the key code exists in our object, and if it does, then we pass it into the handler function, and this is where we're just passing in that key value. We're getting the key value, and then we're checking to see what the key value is. And if it's left, then we're also checking to see and make sure that the player hasn't gone out of bounds. And if they're good to move left, then we decrease the box value of X. So this allows us to reset that value where we're moving the X position. And then we're also decreasing the value of the square so that we're calculating out which square the player is actually on. So this helps us avoid having to have collision detection, because once these two match, wherever the box is and the player square is, then we can really easily select from our squares array and figure out what square the player is on. And then we need that, of course, to check to see if the player has hit the active square. So those two do need to match. We have our right, and with right, we need to also account. So we've got our game area right position. So this is the furthest pixel point on the game area, which is right. But we also need to subtract our offset width of the box, because otherwise we know that this box isn't 0 wide. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for that. And the same thing for the bottom. So the bottom, and we need to subtract the offset height in this case. So that gives us the ability to keep the player in bounds. And then up is straightforward, just like left. We're just making sure to see that it's greater than the area top. Next, we're updating the style properties of the element. So this is what actually creates the visual movement, where we're updating that style value within the element with the class of box. And then we're using that box X and Y variables that we set within the object. And then lastly, here we're checking to see if the squares, player squares, so the player square is the square that the player is on, and the squares is the array that contains all the square elements. So we check to see if this element has a class of active, and if it does, then we've found our target. And then we remove that class of active so that we only have one on screen at a time, and we make another one. And then we increment the score plus plus, and also we update the inner HTML of the score. So essentially that's our entire application, fully functional, and gives you the ability to move through the board and select and find those green squares. And I always do suggest that you play through it a few times just to make sure that you've got the functionality that you were looking for. And in this case, it does seem like everything is working as expected. We even have the ability to dynamically adjust the height and the width of our game board and have our functionality still there and working. So go ahead and try this out for yourself. Make sure that your own project is working the same way that this one is. And if you do need if you do have any questions or need any additional clarification, I'm always happy to help clarify content, as well as if I've got a lot of questions, I'll actually add additional content into this course to help clarify any of the objectives that we're covering. Thanks again for taking the course and this section. I'll see you in the next one.